Let's get the analysis and bring in Neil Melvin. Neil is Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Neil, thanks for being with us. I'm wondering what the likes of Churchill and de Gaulle might have made of this one, given their stances on this particular issue. But a joint nuclear deterrent, what do you make of that?
Well, actually, I think reflecting on those historical parallels, there's always been a very close, certainly in the 20th century, security policy between France and the UK. And this is really the contemporary form of it, is that there's a growing anxiety about US commitments to Europe's security. And this extends even to the US extended nuclear deterrence to Europe. And so there's been a bit of a worry about a possible US pullback and what that would mean. And so the UK and France coming together to coordinate their nuclear policies is really a signal to reassure, I think, the two countries, but more widely in Europe, that there could be some kind of European response, even in the terrible eventuality that the US was to pull back.
And in terms of that response and creating that response, of course, there could be, if I'm reading this correctly, great potential for joint defence development, great potential for business as well.
Well, exactly, because I think, the agreement itself, and there was a nuclear component to it, but the actual security and defence dimension was quite a strong commitment by both countries. We've seen this coordination of their nuclear policies and a new mechanism. We've also seen a commitment for new defence industrial cooperation, development of missiles together, but also setting up headquarters for the coalition of the willing around Ukraine, and a strong commitment also to NATO. So we shouldn't see this as an alternative to NATO. Both countries are signing up to strengthen their cooperation in something called the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, an Anglo-French mechanism that could bring between 10 and 50,000 troops from both countries together to work through NATO.
And that would be a remarkable achievement if it is done. Is this sounded like a sort of mini EU-style army development in some way, shape or form? I know that's quite an explosive thing to say, but you see what I'm getting at, sort of greater cooperation. You know, we're sort of in the post-Brexit era, but here we have the UK and France working together almost like nothing happened.
Well, I think it is very much a sign of the times, but it's also noticeable that this is happening in a bilateral context. So I don't think this is a first step to anything like a European army. What it is very clearly is that there's a push all across Europe to work together more. Countries that are in Europe, in the EU, in NATO, outside the EU and outside NATO are finding cooperative mechanisms. And I think this next month we're going to see an Anglo-German treaty that's also going to consolidate their relationship. So then we have three core treaties: the Aachen Treaty between Germany and France, the agreement today between France and the UK building on Lancaster House agreements from 2010, and the new Anglo-German treaty that really consolidates the three biggest countries in Europe around defence and security questions.
Neil, can you bear with us a second, because we're going to turn to another aspect of the story and then get you back in to comment on that. So please, Neil Melvin there at the Royal United Services Institute, please bear with us. 10 billion euros in investment earmarked for Ukraine at the special summit in Rome. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni revealing the figures that represent fresh investment in a new equity fund and public-private partnerships amid uncertainties over the US commitment to Kyiv's defense. Volodymyr Zelensky told the gathering that investing in Ukraine, and especially in its domestic defense industry, was in Europe's own security interest.
Dear colleagues,
15 heads of state and hundreds of business leaders gathered on Thursday for a special conference on Ukraine hosted by the Italian Premier. While Kyiv has seen a recent escalation in Russian airstrikes, Volodymyr Zelensky and his wife appealed to their allies for investment to help rebuild, but also defend the country.
In June alone, Russia launched more than 330 missiles, alongside nearly 80 ballistic ones, over 5,000 combat drones, and 5,000 aerial bombs at Ukrainian cities. The scale of destruction is difficult to describe.
We must stop Russian drones and missiles. And this means more air defense supplies and more investments in interceptor drones, air defense systems, and of course missiles.
Zelensky thanked those countries and companies that have already invested and called for Russia's frozen assets, and not just the interest, to be put towards Ukraine's recovery. The British and French leaders, meanwhile, dialed in from London for a coalition of the willing meeting at the conference, where they discussed new sanctions on Moscow. The German Chancellor called out Slovakia for blocking more sanctions from the EU. He also said Germany would buy Patriot anti-missile systems for Ukraine and sent a clear message.
I have two messages. The one goes to Moscow and to President Putin. The message is quite simple. We will not give up. And dear friends, my second message goes to Washington, D.C. and to President Donald Trump. Stay with us and stay with the Europeans. We are on the same page.
The question of American support, which has wavered under Donald Trump, continues to loom large. After Washington announced they would halt some weapon shipments to Ukraine, the US president made a U-turn this week, declaring that he would send more and is considering imposing sanctions on Russia. Washington and Moscow are nonetheless continuing their dialogue, with the American Secretary of State meeting the Russian Foreign Minister in Malaysia on Thursday.
Let's go back to our guest, Neil Melvin of the Royal United Services Institute, where he's Director of International Security Studies. Neil, thanks for bearing with us. 10 billion then announced for Ukraine. Less than expected, but nonetheless a good start.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important commitment, and it comes at a really key moment. But to be honest, the challenge that Ukraine is facing is not really recovery, but how to be rescued at the moment, because it's coming under enormous military pressure. We saw last night nearly 700 Russian drones fired against Ukraine. The Russians are pressing now with tens of thousands of troops in Donbass and in the north of Ukraine. So, I mean, Ukraine is really, I think, between a rock and a hard place with the lack of supplies coming from the West, but also the Russians ramping up for a really sort of hard summer campaign against them.
It's a bit much then to talk about the fact that perhaps Ukraine could develop its own defence industry. Obviously, there's been success in creating drones, and that has worked extremely well. But in terms of creating its own place for manufacturing arms and the hardware that goes with it, that's too ambitious.
Well, I mean, it's already got a very successful defence industry, and they've ramped that up, and that is really why in many ways, they've been able to stay in the fight as long as they have. But the difficulty is that Russia is itself ramping up its defense industry. I mean, I said 700 drones last night. I think Russia is aiming by the autumn to maybe be able to deliver 1,000 drones on a regular basis, hitting Ukraine. And that, of course, saps all the air defenses that they have, which are very expensive. And particularly if the United States is not supplying some of the key weapon systems that Ukraine needs. So this is now a real race to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to hold out over the next 4 to 5 months.
When we see Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, and Sergei Lavrov, his Russian equivalent, sat face-to-face in Malaysia talking about a different way of ending the war, but not elaborating on that. Do we read anything into that, or is that just talk, do you think?
Well, from the Russian side, I think this will be very comforting, because they've been playing all along just for time, because I think President Putin feels that he's in a position now where he can win this war because of the difficulties on arms supplies that Ukraine is having, but also there's a manpower question in Ukraine at the same time as Russia its defense industry is peaking. And the United States appears largely disengaged from actually supporting Ukraine. So these talks, I think, are very dispiriting in Ukraine. You can see that there's a growing sense from Ukraine that they're going to have to rely on themselves without the United States, and possibly even with quite limited support from Europe.
Neil, thank you. We need to leave it there. Neil Melvin, the Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you so much for joining us here in France 24. Thank you for your analysis. Greatly appreciated. Thanks again.